Hello, everyone. Good Hello, everyone. Good morning or good evening, depending on where you are. Welcome to the Women in Power track of Powering the Future Summit 2022. Today, we are going to hear about microgrids and true resiliency in communities. When it comes to microgrids, and you ask me whom to contact, the first name that pops up in my mind would be Nirupama. Nirupama Prakash Kumar is one of the vibrant energy engineers. She completed her post-graduation in energy systems from University of Washington in Seattle and also did an MBA from Cornell University, where she was recognized both as an environmental finance and impact investing fellow as well as emerging markets fellow. She has experience working with organizations like Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, NextEra Energy, Smart Wires, and Bloom Energy. Nero's interests also include the most cost effective methods of making technology accessible to the base of the pyramid. She is heavily involved with IEEE and its humanitarian technology efforts. She is currently chair of the projects monitoring under the IEEE Humanitarian Activities Committee. She is also the IEEE Region 6 Humanitarian Activities Coordinator. She works with the South Asia Working Group of IEEE Smart Village. Nero is also part of IEEE USA's Energy Policy Committee. She has also served as Region 6 Women in Engineering Coordinator in 2011-12, helping set up various women in engineering groups for the benefit of IEEE women engineers. It's my pleasure to welcome Nirupama to this event. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Preeti. This is always an honor, and thank you for calling me a microgrid expert, though I don't think I'm an expert in anything. Um, yeah. So let me start with this slideshow. They're projecting it. Thank you. So what's always interesting is when I asked Preeti, what do I present on? She said microgrids and then resiliency in communities. And at the end of this talk, I want you all to think about two, three things. I mean, I'm guessing most of you are IEEE members and will have some background in electrical engineering. And the first thought that comes to people's mind when you think about resiliency is electrical resiliency and, reliability and all that. But I want you to think about true resiliency in communities and what that means. And that's why I call it true resiliency. It's beyond electrical resiliency because we want to think about why we want microgrids. Why do we want to complicate new technology into our systems? And is it worth it? And what does it mean to be truly resilient? And I want you to take that at the end of this and go with that. So let's see. I'm having some issue with the animations not working in this presentation style, but we'll still go with what I wanted to talk about. So why is resiliency so important today? Why was it not important maybe, yesterday? I want you to think about what's going on right now in Ukraine. So there's an actual war, one of the biggest wars that I'm seeing in my lifetime, and I'm not very young, to be honest. And I thought this would be as small as the Gulf War or something, but it's going on and on for days. And why it's significant? There have been many wars, but and unfortunately, there have been many wars, but with countries that have not influenced our supply chain as much as Russia and Ukraine have. And so anything that's happening in Russia or Ukraine is being looked at with a bigger lens. And we see that, one of the tactics that Russia is using to cripple Ukraine, which is, backed by other countries, of course, is attacking the electrical grid. And they started this in 2015 when they did a cybersecurity attack, which is when the hackers shut down the Ukrainian power grid. And before this, there was always the fear that hackers could do a cyber attack. This has been an ongoing fear. If you go to the, Spy Museum in Washington, D.C., there's an entire room that talks about cyber security and how, these days cyber attacks are clear on the power grid. And so they did this in 2015. But then now the actual bigger war starts and they go and, capture a nuclear plant. they get access to their one of their biggest power plants. And if that wasn't enough, they have also struck Ukraine's infrastructure, causing blackouts in many regions. People are literally in the cold. And so, one thing is, it's become even more clear that if we have a grid that's so vulnerable, we need to start thinking differently. And Ukraine, yes, it's a country in war, and yes, it's a country that's been crippled, but it was almost joining NATO. It's not really a poor country. So, what happens when even less infrastructure filled countries are under attack? So, why is cybersecurity so important now? And that's because hackers usually use sophisticated means like phishing emails and all, and they penetrate the IT system. And once the IT system is compromised, they go and shut down the OT system. So, with all this data and communications that we now talk about in the smart grid, and when it comes to microgrids, it becomes even more important to have all the data and communication. Systems must be cyber secure. And why is it important to have data and communications today is because we literally have data in our hands. I mean, my iPhone, I'm sitting and looking at WhatsApp status from hundreds of family members, hundreds of friends every morning. Then I go on Facebook and I get status of many other people, including friends and family that I don't speak to on a daily basis. I get the news on this, I get my emails on this. There is so much data with us right now that once we put that data in the power system, it becomes very vulnerable. And we have to make sure it's cyber secure. But what does that have to do with microgrids? And here is the clincher. When systems are cyber secure, you also tend to, any cybersecurity expert will tell you, you also tend to give them some autonomous operation. Once you've given autonomous operation, what you do is you give autonomous operation to smaller systems within a bigger system. Once you've given that autonomous operation, what is the smaller system within the bigger electrical grid system? A microgrid. How about giving the microgrid autonomous operation? And what does autonomous operation means? What happens is when a system realizes it's under attack, let's say it's a device or a microgrid, as soon as it realizes that it's under cyber attack, it just shuts off all communication with the outside world and goes back to protocols which tell it how to operate now when there is no communication with the bigger centralized grid. And it starts behaving in that autonomous behavior because now it has no communication. And these systems can do it and have done it, and cybersecurity experts are very good at doing it. So when we need that kind of autonomous operation in our power grid, hey, it's a microgrid then. And this autonomous behavior, unfortunately or fortunately, today means a very secure microgrid. To me, it should be the default of what we should be doing. But we are in 2022, and even today, an autonomously operating microgrid under cyber attack is not very common. So another, it's not like Ukraine power grid was just attacked in 2015, a few months back. Today, like literally the news is that Kiev, which is one of the capital city of Ukraine, faces complete shutdown, and this is under freezing temperatures. So this picture is of people waiting to get a blanket and an electrical lamp. So because their power grid is fully shut down, and they're waiting outside in these freezing temperatures just to go get this because it's very, they are facing a complete shutdown, and that's how bad the situation is. But forgetting the war, forgetting Kiev for a second, forgetting Ukraine for a second, I want to come to the US, where clearly it's one of the most developed countries in the world, one of the biggest economies. And, one should be like, oh, there should be no power shutdowns, right? Like a developing country or something. But no, we have power shutdowns. And one of the things that's happening, like last week, what happened is in California, we have wildfire threats in the mountains or where there is lots of dense vegetation. There is a lot of transmission lines as well. But because of heavy winds and dry conditions, these transmission lines are sometimes they hit those trees which have become dry and cause wildfires. And because of this, our utility called Pacific Gas and Electric has gotten a lot of lawsuits because these wildfires obviously have killed entire towns, and it's been very devastating in California. And so what PG&E now has gotten the permission to do is, as soon as it sees dry and windy conditions, it'll go shut off those transmission lines in those very high vegetation areas. The problem is these high vegetation areas, those transmission lines are what feeds all the downstream load in cities like Fremont, where I live. Full Bay Area is powered by those transmission lines. So our distribution lines get affected as soon as PG&E shuts down those transmission lines. And so, like, as recent as I think 2 weeks or 3 weeks back, PG&E had told customers in 13 California counties that they could have power shut off this weekend, and all because of this wildfire threat. And that goes on till Thanksgiving. Of course, we've had started having rains, which is not which is very uncommon in California because we have drought, but we have had some rain. So as soon as rain comes, all the conditions become a little better. But still, in some counties, it's still dry enough that PG&E says, "I'll shut down your power because I'm going to shut down this transmission line due to wind conditions." So that's that. And this shutdown happens for days together. 3 4 days you can go without power. What do you do for food? What do you do for heat? It's really cold right now. My heater is buzzing behind me. So how do you handle all this in California when PG&E shuts down the power? And if I go to the northeast, I mean, the US is a big country. And so it's a full continent away. Western New York is right now facing an unprecedented storm due to what's called lake effect. This is in Buffalo, New York. They're close to Toronto. So I'm sure Toronto and Canada is also facing the same thing. Buffalo and Toronto are big cities with a lot of people, and there are lakes between them. And these lakes cause what's called the lake effect, but it's unprecedented right now. And the power lines have come down. As soon as all that snow fell, all the storms, the power lines have shut down. And this is happening across Western New York. Now, this is not, of course, if it was in warmer regions like Florida, there are hurricanes. We had a hurricane 2 3 weeks back. That also shuts down power when it happens because power lines are overhead. And so many people think, oh, should we just do underground power lines? It's really expensive in a country like the US to do underground power lines when such storms occur once in every 10 years. And that's what the thinking was. And so we always kept it overground. But then these storms are becoming more and more common. And there's no way to deny now that climate change is causing these storms to become so common that we are facing these power shutdowns. And people are thinking, should I do underground power lines? But hey, we are in 2022 and people are going, how about microgrids that are not dependent on transmission and distribution issues and down power lines and shut down transmission lines, etc.? So another reason why resiliency is so important now, we are facing unprecedented times with the climate and with wars, etc. So storm hardening is very critical now. But like I said, everybody kept thinking storm hardening is just putting things underground and putting things inside sheds, etc. Yes, within a microgrid, within a community, you may want to do some storm hardening, but does it have to be at the centralized, transmission level? Because upstream central infrastructure can have widespread and heavily uncomfortable downstream effects. Not having insights in, and the other issue that people face is distribution systems in California, at least, do have solar, rooftop solar. We do have storage, etc. But then people went and put these systems without any communication back. Now, it did happen in Europe also, where they have a lot of rooftop solar that they had, one big gas generator go off. So what happened is that when such a big generator goes off, the system will have low voltage issues. So they started shutting down the system, and they shut down all the distribution power systems also, not realizing that some of the voltage was being maintained because these distribution systems were on. And when they shut off those lines, these rooftop solars also went off the system. And the system had a bigger collapse than they thought, because it's very hard to know what power plant is giving that voltage support. There's no way of knowing it. It's not a system. Of course, with a little bit of data and insights, they would have known that there are these rooftop solars that they'll be shutting down. So they would have not shut them down had they known that there is some kind of a current source. At that point, the rooftop solar would have been a current source, but there is some kind of a generation coming from the other side. So what happens is we can put microgrid, we can put all kinds of distribution systems, but they have to be communicating systems. And once you start communication and putting all the status, they start moving into the realm of what we call microgrids. So yes, we have all the rooftop solar. We don't have microgrids yet in California as much as I would like. We have a lot of rooftop solar, but without insights, these systems are going to make it even more difficult for optimal running of the grid. And we know by experience that has happened. And storm hardening no longer means underground lines. Especially in California, we have earthquake issues. So it's no longer that, oh, just put lines underground. How about we just make these so distributed and so communication heavy that we make them through microgrids? Also, in California, this was before IEEE 1547 came up with intentional islanding. What was required by IEEE 1547 when California had all these rooftop solar is, let's say there's an outage on a distribution feeder. If there's an outage on a distribution feeder and you have a rooftop solar, this system also was supposed to go down. And there's a reason for this. This is because if a system is running on your rooftop and starts feeding back power, and the power from the onboard line is zero because it has been downed, and a line man or line woman comes there and tries to fix that line, they're going to get shocked because of this reverse power. And this is because systems didn't have any way of communicating back the status. Like I said, everything was very dumb and people just had rooftop solar, but there was no insight unless you went and checked an interconnection agreement paperwork or something, which you don't have time for in a storm. So because of that, IEEE 1547 required that any inverter that was supplying a solar had to shut down so that reverse power doesn't happen. Now, this, like I said, we have days without power if PSPS happens, and people started saying, it's perfectly sunny. I have this rooftop solar. Why am I without power here when this line is shut down? I'm totally in the dark. So just because just because my DG doesn't have insights, what do I do? So 1547 did change to intentional islanding. And in that, it means that you can become a microgrid or an intentional island, I would say, even if you don't have any communication back, as long as your inverter is capable of not putting reverse power back. So as long as the inverter becomes a voltage source, it's no longer a current source and throwing power back, it becomes a voltage source and becomes its own independent microgrid at that point. It's fine even if you don't have insights. But yes, with insights, it's even better. And when I say insights, I mean this system communicating back to some kind of a central control system that, hey, I'm here, I'm running, I'm powering this house. So DG without insights also should run when they need to, and they can. Like I said, in California, when the power goes off, people want their rooftop solar to actually produce. So we see everybody moving towards intelligent microgrids more and more, not because I am saying so or somebody is saying so. Now, cost of electricity, which is, I should say, staring at all of us, is even worse than had I given this talk a year ago. Retail electricity, and this is because of really the natural gas prices shooting up. Retail electricity prices are continuing a rapid rise even in the US. We have a big inflation problem going on. We have a lot of layoffs because the government is raising the interest rates. And why is the government raising the interest rates? Because we have unprecedented inflation. I've never seen this kind of inflation in my time in the US, which has been almost 16 years that I've lived here. Prices used to be constant. Now food costs double of what it used to cost before. And that is not very common here. It happens in many other countries. And we are being told that we could pay more than 15 cents per kilowatt hour next year, which is scary. Then I'm saying, then I have a condo, which is, it really means a flat. I stay in a community, so I can't put rooftop solar because the roof is not my property in a HOA setting in a condo complex. So I'm struggling because then I'm like, why do I want to pay more? Can we have a community solar in my condo complex so that we can make our own solar energy and get it for cheaper than paying PG&E, who's my utility, all this money to get me power? And that's a thought that's going through. As the prices increase, people will start demanding that I take back my power. And we have except for the 2 months of rain, like I said, we get very little rain. We have a drought issue going on. Except for the 2 months of rain, we get a lot of sun here. So we can produce a lot of solar energy. So why will I not do that? Then, go and pay so much retail electricity price for electricity that's probably natural gas based, and that's why the costs are increasing. Now, Europe has a bigger problem. They were importing a lot from Russia, and when those imports became a problem because of the Ukraine-Russia crisis, Europe's electricity prices, just like in Asia, have really quadrupled. And this has caused a lot of issue. Europe's household electrical bills could surge by 2 trillion. And the worst part is in UK, it's going to be even worse. And this is because of the energy crisis. Natural gas prices are through the roof. And this is and the bottom picture is a picture from Sri Lanka, where you can see that it's cheaper to have two people with, proper guns like AK-47 manning a gas station. And that's because LNG price spike has caused a energy crisis in Asia. And this is not just in Sri Lanka. It's happening in Pakistan. It's happening in Bangladesh. It's happening in India, and not just South Asia. It's happening in Southeast Asia. Like in Thailand, they are beginning to, ration energy because there's a crisis in East Asia. A crisis is going on. Probably the only people who have probably blanketed themselves well from this crisis is China. But many other countries, even when they're looking towards Russia for oil, are still having a crisis because they are importing LNG from other sources where the price is high. So a crisis like no other, because inflation has become so high. Inflation had not much to do with the war, by the way, in the US. It had to do with how heated our economy had become because of all kinds of issues and, in low interest rates during COVID and other problems. So there was a quantitative easing that was going on here. And now, as quantitative tightening is going on, we are feeling the brunt of the reverse, where people are losing jobs, etc. But that's also, in a weird way, required because of our inflation. So again, cost of electricity has become so important right now. And people in Europe are also saying, why can't I just produce my own electricity in my house when the sun shines? And I wanted to show this chart because it's in the US. I mean, the yellow line you see here, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but the yellow line you see here is actually the US, which has kept its natural gas prices relatively low. And this is because the US produces its own natural gas. So the government can go and exercise some options to keep the natural gas prices low. It can stop exports, etc. Because the US produces so much of its natural gas, even though price of gas is very high right now, it can still be kept low compared to many other countries where, there is not enough production and there's more import. Now, the red line and the blue line are costs in Asia and Europe. And you can see that Asia and Europe are following each other very closely. And look at the price exponential growth that is happening. In Japan, it's still kept subdued. Japan does import from the US and all that. And, there's some reason to keep it lower. And so they have insulated themselves well, pun not intended. But Asia and parts of Europe have not been able to do it. And it's a crisis there. So these are pictures from, Asia and in Europe, where they are having fuel poverty right now. People are not able to pay for their electricity, and it's getting colder and colder by the day. So why did this happen? There is become limited gas supply due to the Russian Ukrainian crisis, and reduced domestic gas supplies because they didn't have as much energy storage as they thought they would. Even if they did, the gas supply from Russia, they were used to import 40% from Russia. And then there's an increased cost because now when they're looking towards gas supply from other countries, Asia is also looking towards those countries. So OPEC has gone and increased the prices. And that's because there's a huge demand in Asia too. And this is causing a crisis in Europe. And the same crisis has also landed Asia in a crisis because they have a lot of dependence on fossil fuel import. And it's very ironic because as much as I say that the sun is, very bright in California and I can make a lot of solar, the sun is even brighter in places like Pakistan or Sri Lanka or India or Bangladesh. And like Sri Lanka, especially, is near the equator. There's so much sun there. And yet, because of fossil fuel import, they are having an issue. What if they had insulated themselves by actually doing more renewable energy and more renewable energy microgrids, because the grid can have distribution losses, et cetera, et cetera. And this is where and like, panels are very cheap. They come from China. They are very cheap to import. So could they have done something different rather than look at import fossil fuel? And of course, in the US too, despite natural gas prices being kept relatively low compared to, places like Europe, The natural gas price rise and inflation has caused the electricity to go up in the US as well. So we are also feeling the pinch. Maybe not as bad as Europe, but it's pretty bad compared to what the US was used to. And the climate crisis, while this is a very ironic thing, I want to tie it back to the fact that, I said the storms like hurricanes and lake effects and, windstorms and wildfires cause a lot of issues to our electric supply. But the electric supply coming from fossil fuels is going back and heating the planet and causing more of the climate crisis. So this is like a reverse cycle. The climate crisis is causing more issues than I want to deal with in my electric supply. But as long as I keep my electric supply and my energy supply really as fossil fuel based and as carbon intensive as it is right now, the climate crisis is only going to worsen. We've had more wildfires and more hurricanes in the history of the US than ever before. And everybody would keep saying by 2020, by 2020. And I used to laugh, like, why say 2020? But 2020 was a very monumental year. There really was a cliff. And we are just staring at it. And we are saying that the climate crisis is worsening. And yet the whole world is having an energy crisis due to fossil fuels and, the price of fossil fuel. It's very, very ironic right now. And so why is clean energy so important right now? Like I said, fossil fuel import dependency is literally causing the energy crisis around the world. And the climate crisis, on the other hand, is also being caused by fossil fuel usage. So it's very, like, come on, this is just a writing in the wall. But then it's not just putting a bunch of solar, it's putting a bunch of solar or storage that can actually communicate back to the grid. And that's why I'm saying microgrids. And then climate-based storms are worsening the energy reliability and hence making the need for more reliable and resilient systems more urgent. People often ask, what's the difference between reliability and resiliency? And I always like to say this in everything. Resiliency is always the characteristic of a system of how soon it can come back once it has shut down. So if you have a diesel generator, for example, it takes a little bit of time to come back up and heat up, etc. If you have a fuel cell, it's the same thing. Once it shuts down, it takes some time to ramp up again and heat up and all that. Versus if you have a solar generator or solar, solar power system, if the inverter shuts down also, once it comes back up within few seconds or microseconds. So the resiliency of such systems is very high. Versus the resiliency of systems that take longer is lower. But reliability of a system is how long can it stay up. For example, if I only have a solar system, once the sun stops shining, it'll stop. So the resiliency may be high, but the reliability is low. Versus a diesel generator or a fuel cell, the resiliency may be lower than a solar system, but the reliability will be high because once they are on, they can be on for days together as long as the fuel supply is there. So the thing is, we don't need just resilient systems. We need reliable systems. But at the same time, there are cases like you can't have hospitals with systems that are taking hours to come up. People are literally on life support there. Then you need resilient systems that are also reliable. So we need to make our systems more resilient and more reliable. So it can't be just a solar system. It can't be just an engine generator. What if I combine the two? And so the solar comes on for some time, or even a battery system, because solar still needs the sun. The battery can come up very quickly. So the battery comes up and stays on till it can, till the engine generator or the fuel cell powers up. And once the fuel cell or engine generator powers up, it can take over and make the system reliable. So this combination of systems is again the microgrid. And like I said, as long as it can communicate its status back, that was the definition of microgrids people were going for 10 years back when people started thinking of them more seriously. So the dimensions really become resiliency, cost, and clean energy. And I want to say that this is the dimensions of true resiliency. Because if costs keep increasing like they're increasing in Asia and Europe, or even in the US, there's no way that people are going to be resilient anymore. You can have all the electrical resiliency you want in a system. If the system is too expensive, soon people will be without power. Soon societies will start collapsing, and they are right now as we speak. So cost is an important dimension of what I call true resiliency. It's no longer just electrical resiliency. It is the resiliency to all, it is resiliency in the sense that the cost is affordable by a huge component of the population. Not just the rich can afford it, but even the average middle class to lower middle class person, even the poor can afford it. Nobody should be cold. And then resiliency is also clean energy. I don't want a storm that's going to worsen my system. I want a system that can be sustainable, that can go on and on for days together, for years together. And that means that I want a system that's not going to worsen the electrical resiliency of the system. So this is really resiliency in my book is sustainability also. And what can they help with? The energy crisis right now and the climate crisis right now. These two crises are only becoming worse by our use of fossil systems. But we need a system that is, like I said, resilient, cheap, and clean. And we can achieve all this by distributed microgrids that are powered with sustainable fuels. Am I the only one saying this, by the way? The picture at the back is, a bombed hospital in Ukraine. But this is from literally from yesterday. Solar storage microgrid sought for Ukraine as Russia bombards the grid. So I'm not the only one saying it. In Ukraine, people are thinking about solar storage microgrids. But again, like I said, people start just putting a solar and storage system with no communication whatsoever or minimal communication and call it a microgrid, and that's fine. But I say in today's world where I have a computer literally in my hand, we should be thinking higher. And this is, as a power systems engineer, there's no way that I should keep settling for solar plus storage. Of course, under war conditions, you do what you can, but there has to be a sophistication to thinking that I would challenge everybody to think about, not just me, but future generations, people who are younger than me, because solar plus storage is, so 2010, 10 years ago, people would thought this was cool. This is no longer cool. It has to be a better system. So what's a microgrid? And I took this from, somebody, these kind of pictures you'll see a lot. Like I said, every system becoming its own little entity, either because there is an attack or because there is an electrical need. But you can have wind, you can have electrical vehicle charging, so that, our transportation is one of the biggest polluters in the world. And transportation can be made clean by having electrical vehicles or even hydrogen vehicles, for example. But hydrogen is also going to be produced from green power. So it'll also be part of the power system. So then you have electrical vehicles that can make the transportation green. That means they again get attached to the electrical grid. So you can have wind, you can have storage. Like I say, storage makes it a little more reliable because it can produce power even when the wind is not blowing or the sun is not shining. You can have electrical vehicles charging. Then you can have an industrial plant with its own generation. Let's say the industrial plant is making hydrogen, for example. It can use hydrogen for generation. If it's not making hydrogen, it can have a diesel or a natural gas generator. There is natural gas need, but we have to keep it at a minimum. Then there is the demand management, which is, sometimes I do this. We have a bad habit, like in the US, I keep my microwave on all the time. And it shows a little clock, which takes a lot of my, power consumption. It may not be earth shattering, but still, why do I need that power consumption? I don't even use the microwave every day. I don't cook lots of food in the microwave. I just reheat food maybe once a week in it. And yet my microwave stays on. And some days I have to remember to unplug it. Then I'll go back and once a week plug it and then forget it again. And that's a very bad habit. So in these kind of things, can I have demand management? I'm still trying to figure out how to take my electrical range out of the system when I'm not using it. Because my electrical range is also always powered on and there's a clock going on. And I'm like, I don't want this, but I still haven't figured out. And I'm an electrical engineer with 2 electrical engineering degrees. So go figure. So if I'm having so much of problem with demand management, and I've done demand response research, if I'm having so much problem, what will the average Joe or Jane face in this system? We really need clever demand management that can help dumb people do demand management without having to figure this out. Even I'm not able to figure it out. I'm sure others will not even be thinking of it. So we need to make systems that can stop themselves from consuming power when we don't need it. And this is a big problem that we have, where systems are constantly consuming power. And like I said, a microgrid can have solar. It can also be an isolated grid. Sometimes systems want to become their own systems. They don't want to be dependent on PG&E, for example, here in California, because they feel that the voltage or frequency is not at a limit that they want. So they want to become their own microgrid so that they can have more control over their voltage and frequency. There is a farm, for example, here that's wanted to become its own isolated microgrid, because farms are very at a distance, and then when that happens, there are lots of voltage and frequency fluctuation issues in a downstream feeder, in a long rural feeder. So these farms are like, I don't want to deal with this. I don't want to deal with the utility voltage and frequency issues. I'll become my own microgrid and put my own systems. Now, each of these systems, though, cannot just function by themselves. They have to communicate with each other and communicate to a central control system that's aware of all these systems, that's aware that there's a vehicle charging station going on, and it's actually charging a vehicle right now or not charging a vehicle right now, that this wind farm is producing because there is wind blowing or not blowing, that the storage system is operating or not operating. This need not be a human being sitting there and looking, but a controller that can observe all this and make some intelligent decisions when one system is down and the other system is producing, etc., etc. Like I said, what happened in Europe, where literally they went and shut down, not realizing they are shutting down extra power producing units, is what we need now. Everybody should be aware of what's coming on the grid. So unfortunately, something has happened, and this slide deck is not looking, has eaten up some of the words I wanted, but I'll anyway talk about it. So what is the definition of a microgrid? We come to that. These are very simple definitions that people have given. And I always challenge the definition because we have so much more capacity right now. But let's go with this definition. A microgrid is a group of interconnected loads and distributed energy resources that act as a single controllable entity with respect to the grid. So as far as the grid is concerned, this is just one single entity, though there may be other components within it. And it can connect and disconnect from the grid to operate in grid connected or islanded mode. I've had an issue where somebody who's relatively smart keeps thinking that a microgrid has to be grid connected to be called a microgrid, and that's not true. So yes, while this definition says that it can connect and disconnect from the grid, an islanded system, literally in an island, is a microgrid. You can have an isolated system that can also be a microgrid. It doesn't have to always connect to the grid to be called a microgrid. But if it's connected to the grid, then you need more insight. And that's why I call it with greater IoT or Internet of Things, what can we do? Some words have been eaten out of my slide. I apologize for that. I should have been more careful. But what was I trying to say there? With greater IoT, we have the capacity to integrate intermittent resources like solar and wind, firming resources like energy storage. So energy storage is not a base resource, but it can firm things. It can firm solar, it can firm wind. It can make them into a constant supply if you only, size the storage enough. But that's where it gets tricky, because you can never size a big enough storage. So while it's a firming thing, I still like base resources. I like base resources like fuel cell and engine generators, etc. Now, all these resources can be integrated even more if they communicate, because then it becomes an IoT of things. So the capacity to integrate these resources has become real for the first time. Integrate these systems into a microgrid, and by intermittent resource, you can also put demand response into that intermittent resource. And demand response is when the load reacts, because demand response is not constant. I may not shut off my microwave for the whole time. I may actually plug it in whenever I want to heat the food. So it's my demand response from a microwave is not constant. So you can have demand response or load response also part of this, as long as the load is actually giving its status all the time. And then the other thing I wanted to say is, with greater IoT, my definition of microgrid, which I borrow from some of the big experts out there, including this professor from MIT, is it has to have more observability, controllability, and measurability. And those three characteristics make for a microgrid, not just putting a solar plus storage system. That's where I begin to differ from the more simplistic definitions. But at the same time, a simplistic microgrid is not wrong. And I've also spoken about how we should have maturity models for microgrids. So if it's a simplistic microgrid, we say it's a level 1 microgrid. Just like there's the CMM levels for software, you have maturity levels for microgrid. So if it's a very sophisticated microgrid, one should say, hey, it's a level 5 microgrid, so that we start making a differentiation between the sophistication and intelligence that different microgrids bring. So, what is observability? In the sense you can observe all the entities within a microgrid. Measurability is you don't just observe them, but you can actually measure what they are producing, what's their frequency, what's their voltage, what's their current levels. And then controllability is now you're not just measuring and observing that they are there, you can actually go and control them. So a microgrid, if it provides bigger controllability, observability, and measurability, it's really very valuable. But then you should flip back and ask me the question, then what about cybersecurity? If somebody can observe, control, and measure the microgrid, it's then open to a lot more attacks than we want. And this is where a microgrid must realize if it's an attack mode, or if it's a non-cyber secure mode, then it must go into an autonomous operation where the microgrid is doing the observability, controllability, and measurability of its entity. And as far as the central grid is concerned, or the central control system is concerned, it must give only one value. This way we can both insulate the microgrid from attacks, but also keep this kind of insight into the microgrid. Both things can be achieved. So standards like IEEE 1547, intentional islanding, etc., are helping DGs become more observable, measurable, and controllable microgrids. And by doing this, we can integrate more DG renewables, because renewables are intermittent. And if you don't know what they're producing at any given point of time, you'll have no clue whether that system is producing. At least the sun, it's shining. Wind blowing at a certain wind farm is very difficult to know unless you're actually measuring wind there. So once you have this kind of observability, measurability, and controllability of the microgrid, you can help integrate more renewables. And it can provide grid services. Now, grid services are usually frequency support, voltage support, and those kind of things, or demand response. Now, what do I mean by demand response from a microgrid? For example, I used to work in Nextera, which also owns Florida Power and Light. And certain times of the year, the system used to get very stressed because there was just too much load on the system. So what FPL had done is it had given engine generators to some of its big industrial and commercial customers, like a manufacturing plant or something like that, so that when the system would get stressed, these facilities would go on that engine generator and shut off from the main grid and relieve that load from the main grid. But at the same time, they had this engine generator, so they would be powered on, but as their own independent system. Now, the FPL completely knew who had engine generators and who had turned on and all that. And I used to work for Nextera Analytics, which had a lot of insight into who was turning on and who was turning off, and who didn't turn off and who didn't turn on, etc. So there was a lot of real-time observability. And being Florida, there was less concerns with privacy. And these are also commercial and industrial manufacturing systems or something. So people are not that worried about privacy issues and all that. So that's why I say real-time high latency data on independent operation. These systems used to actually provide the data. So it wasn't just voltage support and frequency support as in throwing power back. Sometimes a microgrid does the best service to the system by actually shutting itself off from the system. It need not even throw power back into a system. But imagine a system where a microgrid is producing too much solar and the rest of the system is getting stressed because too much load is coming on, and then PG&E says, hey, can I get more power from you, please? Or FPL says, can I get more power from you, please? Because my traditional power plants are not producing enough. And then this microgrid can produce and also make some money and provide some grid services. In California, that's becoming a reality now, because in the summer, especially with drought, we were retiring our nuclear plants because there's a lot of concerns with nuclear energy being safe. We were trying to retire our natural gas plants because there's a lot of concerns with climate change. But once you retire nuclear or gas plants and you have drought, you won't have your hydrogen units running as much. And then solar is intermittent. So what do you do? And I was speaking, for example, to people who are battery manufacturers, some of the top battery manufacturer names here in the Bay Area. And even like Bloom Energy, for example, their fuel cells sit quiet in the summer sometimes because, the load is not much on the customer's facility on a commercial site. But then the grid has a lot of load going on. People are turning on their air conditioners. So whether it's, fuel cell manufacturer or a battery manufacturer, they are thinking, hey, I have all these installations. How about for a fee? And PG&E is ready to pay the fee. they're saying, how about for a fee, I actually produce more in the summer and give that support to the California grid so that they can go ahead and retire these gas generators and these nuclear plants. Now, before, when people didn't have this kind of communication, I mean, when what the fee actually is a signal that comes where PG&E is saying, hey, can you provide me support and I'll pay you this much? And this system in turn reacts and says, yes, I'm ready to provide you the support. This is how much support I can give you at this rate. That's transactional energy right there. And so they have this transaction because now they can communicate. And when they have this kind of communication, they can actually provide services in real time and give that support back to the grid. And that's how you can retire these plants. This wasn't the case when we didn't have this kind of observability, measurability, controllability, and transaction power that can go on right now. And it's happening right now, by the way. I'm not saying something that's futuristic, but still people are not doing it as much as they should because not many people think about it. And unfortunately, I think about it more than I should. And then, of course, like I said, it can be autonomous if needed, just like FPL is doing these autonomous systems. They go on engine generators. I'm saying autonomous requirement is also because of the cyber attacks, like what happened in Ukraine. Even if they get solar plus storage systems, Russia should not be able to attack them just because they have become measurable or, observable. So microgrids in homes, because Preeti wanted me to talk, and I'm just aware of the time here, but I'll just quickly say, microgrids in homes are also becoming very common now. In people, like I said, in Ukraine, people are thinking. In Europe, people are looking at Ukraine and saying, "I want more of this." They're not only looking at Ukraine; they're looking at their energy costs and saying, "I want more of this so that I can use the solar and the wind." And a place like the Dutch were already doing it before because they had all this wind, and they used to use this wind before microgrids and all these fancy words came in. So it's not just rooftop solar. People use wind in places in Europe already. They were already using windmills in Europe. So how do we integrate intermittent resources like solar and energy storage, like I said, as a firming, and then residential fuel cells, which is base power, and then demand response, again intermittent. And these systems can become microgrids in homes. And like I said, they can be made autonomous for special situation, including when communication is lost. So systems need to be autonomous, not just because there was a cyber attack, but sometimes communication can actually get lost. There can be downed power and communication lines. In this case, the system needs to know what it should do when communication with the central power system is lost. And that's when you have to build an autonomous operation into these systems. They must have enough intelligence to know what they should do when there's no central signal being received. But of course, when you have such observability, measurability, and controllability of these kind of multiple resources in homes, privacy concerns become very, very serious, because I don't want the government or some kind of a utility knowing when did I turn on my microwave and when did I turn off my microwave or what I'm watching at home. Then community aggregation becomes the key, so that once you aggregate, then everybody's individual consumption becomes irrelevant. And so that's where microgrids and homes can function with the grid, as long as there is enough aggregation that there is no privacy concerns with what I'm individually doing. And so we have to think about how do we make microgrids more observable, controllable, and measurable, but with privacy in mind. So Preeti also told me, and I think this should be my last slide, how do we prepare for a career in microgrids, and especially for women in power? And I say, go with the basics, study the basics, which is have some knowledge of power systems, have some knowledge of power electronics, go and take a course in renewable energy and energy storage and demand response, if you can get those courses. If you don't get those courses in your university or something, go find online courses and read about it, or go attend conferences and learn from speakers who are speaking about it, or come to webinars like this and learn something new every single time. But like a career in anything, a career in microgrid starts with a passion for wanting to change the world and becoming observant every day. Even at my age, I keep reading the news and I say, what is happening in Ukraine and how can we change it? How can we make it better? Because I have to know, what do I go and tell my company? What do we do? Now, people in my company are not waiting for me to hear, but they are also reading the same news and they are doing the same thing. So when you build a career, slowly as you're trying to climb up the ladder, you have to think about every day thinking, how can I tell people what we should be doing differently. They may not listen to me now, but soon I'll be old enough that they'll be listening to me, old enough and senior enough that I'll be giving the direction to everybody on what we should be doing. And in that case, I have to plan and be doing this kind of thing every single day so that it becomes a habit. Then especially for women and also for men, because this happens to men too, you should have a strong determination for not taking others' opinions and thoughts as input unless it's positive, validating, and nurturing. Despite Preeti's very flattering introduction, I have people who still doubt if I have any knowledge of microgrids, if I've done anything, and doubt all the time as if I'm not, important enough. And I have to just be like, that's their problem. And I've had people who have no clue of microgrids make those kind of statements. And I make a determination not to take those opinions and thoughts as input because they don't know. And people are actually very dumb, sometimes in leadership positions. And you have to say, if this is not a positive thought, if this is not validating or nurturing, I'm not taking it. Sometimes from your own parents, because parents don't know enough. You have to be your own insulated microgrid when it comes to opinions and thoughts, and only take that is positive, validating, or nurturing. And why I say nurturing, because people often talk about critical feedback. Critical feedback is only good if it's critical feedback is nurturing, not critical in the sense of putting you down. So only take positive, validating, or nurturing thoughts, and then take those inputs. You will know in your gut when somebody is not giving a thought that's good. It'll feel really bad. And do what feels right in your heart. Money follows you when your heart and passion are in it. So this was told by a friend who sold his company for huge dollars to a big name here in the Silicon Valley, and he did exactly that. So ever since, I always remember, follow what feels right in your heart and money will follow you. So that's how I would say that you get a career. And I think with that, it's the last slide and I'm almost out of time. So thank you very much for listening to me, and hopefully you got something out of this. Back to you, Preeti. Preeti, I can't hear you. I think you're on mute.
Yeah, this always happens with the online sessions, even after 2 years or 3 years. Okay. So thank you, Niru, for that wonderful session. Though it was purely technical, it didn't feel like any kind of lecture. It was like a flow of information, I would say. And you were well versed on that. Thank you so much. There's been good discussion even among the participants throughout the session. We do have a couple of questions. I think we
I
have
have all
time.
the time in the world. Yeah, it's Sunday morning for me. So go ahead. Yeah.
Perfect. So there's always a concern for the solar since it is intermittent and especially during the rainy days or nights or during the winter.
Yeah.
Uh, what do we do with solar? There's no exact answer for it, and storage is always a solution for that. And I think one of the participants also mentioned about the same. But do you have any other comments?
No, solar is a tricky thing, right? Like what we had like during the wildfire season, um, we were also having a lot of heat once. So it was very hot, but because there had been wildfires, there was a lot of ash in the atmosphere. Now, ash not only stops the sun from coming into the panels, but it also settles on the panels. And even if the sun comes back on, the ash is on the panels, and if you don't wash it off, the panels can't produce. So we've had issues where it was really hot and the wildfires had started, and our solar stopped producing. So it's not just that it's nighttime or rainy days. Sometimes it can be wild when it's really hot. Rainy days are not that hot. We've had systems that have stopped producing when it's really hot outside, and people were cranking up their air conditioning. My thing to that is always that solar must be, we should put a lot of solar. We should put as much solar as we can do environmentally good for. Solar also has its problems. It's still silicon based and all that. So we should put as much solar, but we should couple it with either excess solar is being produced into hydrogen or energy storage. The reason I'm saying that we should put so much solar is because when the sun does shine, especially in places that are having a crisis, like I'm saying Asia or even California, then it makes no sense not to have solar. Now, one can argue that maybe Ukraine and Russia may not have so much solar, but it's actually not true. And I'm not very well versed with Ukraine and Russia. For example, I went to Calgary to do a IEEE workshop, and I was told by one of the IEEE section members that, oh, we don't have enough solar here, it's very rainy. And that person had no clue. They weren't a PES person. Once I spoke to the PES and electrical engineering professors, I realized they have 330 days of solar in a cold place like Calgary. They produce a lot of solar because it's so high up that the radiance is very high. So then they can use all the solar that they want. So I think that depending on the place, we should absolutely put solar. Like it may not make sense in Seattle, and a lot of people put a lot of solar panels in Seattle, which is very cloudy and rainy all the time. But they still produce some solar. When it comes to if you don't have solar, then I would say go in for something cleaner like fuel cells, which don't produce the NOx, SOx, and carbon emissions. Or we must think about wind, if we can do community wind, and that also helps. Or we integrate solar at a community level where it's shining more. Like we have something called Mojave Desert and Death Valley, etc., in California, where the sun is shining even more than the Bay Area. Bay Area also we have fog issues. So can I produce solar there and bring it? Yes, in that case, I'm not talking about a microgrid, but we must integrate solar. Despite intermittency issues, we are not tapping all the solar that we can find on Earth. And it's one of the most abundant resources out there. But I say integrate it with hydrogen and energy storage, etc. Convert it into hydrogen.
And I think that's the one that is booming up right now. This green hydrogen, especially coupled with wind and solar. So if you don't
Exactly.
have solar at one place, doesn't matter. You can produce it at some other and then transport it via hydrogen or ammonia or
Yeah,
whichever is suitable.
exactly. Exactly. Exactly.
So there's one question: demand response and conservation voltage reduction are load management strategies. Which is more preferred, and why is it so?
So conservation voltage reduction can only happen when you actually. So this is where you reduce the voltage to reduce the power flow, etc. You can do that. I think that CBS only works when you actually have systems that can operate under those low voltage conditions. Now, I have always struggled with it because we used to do a lot of research on this. If you have systems that will uh, doing stop running when you reduce the voltage to a certain degree, then you can't do any more of this. So there's only that much that you can achieve with voltage reduction. Now you can not reduce voltage to beyond a certain point, systems will stop working. So you can only do so much, I would say, conservation by voltage reduction. And that, like I said, once you reduce the voltage, you reduce the power flow, and that's how you're reducing the consumption of the system. I think the demand response is also needed. People always take a easier route in voltage reduction so that the load finally doesn't have to be shut down. But I think both are required, that people start thinking about conserving load more or shutting down loads more while also reducing the voltage. You can do both. I think that neither one should win, or there can be neither one can win because there are limitations to both. At the same time, demand response cannot be the solution to everything because you will turn on the load at the end of the day. So what you have to do is you have to do both. I think the third aspect that also comes in is energy efficiency, that actually making systems more insulated, etc. Like our systems, for example, in the US, homes will be very less insulated and all that. If you make them more insulated, you're actually making them more energy efficient. So I think that's also needed. So these three pillars all, in my mind, come under load response, which should be done.
Thank you for that response. We have one more question. Given the economic burden of installing supporting infrastructure, is demand response economically viable in microgrids?
Yes, I mean you can, when you have home communication systems. Like I said, I would give anything for something to go shut off my microwave rather than me going and remembering to shut it down. I still don't know how to take off my range. I'm like, which is the I'm trying to decide which is the circuit breaker I need to shut off, like to actually shut it down. So I'm like, I think that people like an autonomous operation too, where they don't have to worry about things. So it's not that expensive to put the infrastructure, at least here in the US, where a lot of consumption happens, like users' consumption like this, where there's a clock on my range, there's a clock in my microwave, there's a clock somewhere else. Best part is when power shuts down, which we do have power shutdown because sometimes a squirrel gets into our transformer box or something. These clocks are also not in sync. So I don't even use them as clocks. They're just there, as lights. So I think that the infrastructure is fairly simple and has become very advanced that demand response can be done. I don't see why it can't be done. People have this notion that it's very expensive, but it's not. It's just a simple way to disconnect loads, and people have done it with load switches, etc. So there is no requirement that we continue to do what we are doing, which is not put our infrastructure. Yes, it's more expensive than not, but then the dollar value of the savings over time, especially with my electricity costs right now and the rising electricity costs, will be good enough that I can put those load switches and still be, I would say, still not lose money. So I think it's very important.
Thank you for that response again. I think we are over time by 5 minutes. Sorry for that.
No worries.
So I think with that, I would like to personally and also from the team thank Nirupama for accepting our invitation and being on this Women in Power track of Powering the Future Summit 2022. You have always been a supporter of IEEE Press, and I also remember you were there as part of the Web FM show as well. So you have always been supporting us and also the young professionals and other engineers out there. So thank you so much once again. Wishing you all the best.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thanks to all the participants, for the viewers on LinkedIn, Facebook, and YouTube. Thank you for being with us. Thank you for being so interactive with the speaker and also us. I hope that you enjoyed the session and you also had a great insight from Nirupama. If at all you have any queries, I think she should be accessible via LinkedIn or email.
Yeah,
Anyway,
Preeti has my email in case you guys really want to reach out and talk about anything. I'll be more than happy to have a conversation.
so thank you so much. And to all the participants, the next session is on 26th of November, which is next Saturday. We have two great sessions. One is on career switching. Is it a hurdle or an advantage? By Eugenio. And the second session is based on dynamic modeling and simulation of synchronous generators by Professor Peter. I hope you will have a wonderful session next week as well. Thank you so much. See you then. Bye bye.